Hi, welcome to the first Art Club safety training in our series. Today we're going to talk about handling hazardous materials, how to prevent slips, trips, and falls. We're going to cover this on our safety training. I'm John Kenny. I'm presenting and your training host for this series. CEO of Cottney Consulting Group. I always look forward to working with all the members of the Art Club and participants in the Roofers Coffee Shop. So let's move on to today's presentation. So what we're going to cover today is identifying hazardous materials and possible exposures, hazardous materials and injuries to avoid, methods for eliminating physical hazards, methods to eliminate health hazards, and coordinating with your job site management. So top 10 risks and hazards from working on construction sites are working at height. Number one in roofing. Roofing is usually always done at above the grade unless you're doing waterproofing, and makes it number one fall hazard is the top OSHA violation and cause of death in the construction industry. Moving objects around, slips, trips, and falls, noise for the ears, and arm vibration syndrome, which comes from using heavy equipment on the roof or tearing cutters and so on and so forth. Material and manual handling. A lot of back injuries will come from that. Collapsing trenches. I know you're probably saying, well, trenches, what's that have to do with roofing? Well, you're very well going to come across this if you're doing waterproofing on the side of a foundation and it's dug out. You're going to need to know how the OSHA requirements are for having trench safety. And also when you're crossing through a job site, you want to be aware if there's any trenches dug out so somebody doesn't slip and fall in them. Still come across asbestos in our industry today. Electricity, another large hazard as far as electrical shock and electrocution goes. And then, of course, airborne fibers and other materials. So what is considered hazardous? OSHA defines a hazardous material as any substance or chemical which is a health hazard or physical hazard, which includes chemicals that are combustible, explosive, flammable, oxidizers, pyrophorics, unstable, reactive, or water reactive. So you can get a full list of these by going to OSHA.gov.laws. Here you see the screen, or go to OSHA and you can search them from there. They'll give you a complete list of what they actually have considered these, but it's a majority of the different chemicals that we use in our industry. Also, the SDS sheets that come from the manufacturers will also give you the hazard areas that they fall into. Common roofing hazards. Stability of the roof, placement of the ladder. So let's start with the stability of the roof, right? What do we mean by that? Well, one, if it's say a wooden structure, is it stable and is it capable of supporting the weight of the re-roofing project or new installations going on? The other thing I want you to consider is deck safety. So you want to have a policy in place that actually inspects the deck, make sure there's no falls and different things and so forth that go on during this. You want to check them out and have a policy in place to not only look underneath, and sometimes that may be impossible if there's a solid ceiling, but you got to have a policy in place to check them and do the best you can. Even sometimes it's extra core cuts, but the worst thing you can do is send a crew on a deck that you're unaware of the safety conditions. I've seen plenty of people fall and get hurt, and I've had a few I know of that actually fell through an unforeseen condition in a roofing deck and caused their death, and that's something nobody wants to face. Placement of the ladder, that is the next usual problem and violations that you're going to come across. So it has to be on solid all points. You can't block it up on one side, and it's got to be solid blocking or solid earth. Put it on good secure, out from the building correctly, above the roof line at the proper height, tied off, etc. But make sure your ladders are secured and checked. Weather conditions. So what we mean by weather conditions. Of course, you can't prepare for if a rain comes in and that, but you got to be as prepared as you can. If it's an emergency storm that comes in, how are you going to handle getting off? Is there ability not to have slips and falls? We're not going to talk about the flooding conditions, getting inside the building and keeping your building watertight. That's under another area. I'm not covering that under safety. But you also want to be aware that when you go up on the roof in the morning in colder climates, that the roof could be frozen on the edge and very slippery, or you may be on a certain part of the building and it's sunny and there isn't a slippery condition, and you get to another part where it's in the shade and there is. So weather conditions matter. Lightning, You have to have a plan in place of when you get off a roof, how you get down, all the things that come into protecting your crew. Wind can become a condition where it becomes unsafe to work. So what you have to make sure these policies are in place. Holes in the roof. Again, these are the holes that you can see or not see. I'll just give you a quick story on this one. I saw a great post on LinkedIn the other day that really shows the problems of a roof. Had holes in it that were covered by an existing contractor. Then this contractor came along to re-roof it, and as they were tearing it, they found these extremely dangerous condition. Don't know if they would have been able to pick up on these from an underside inspection if they had that ability to do. That's one area you got to be careful when you're tearing it. Holes weren't covered and properly. The other one is when you know the holes are there, you've got to cover them with some kind of plywood or wood so somebody cannot fall through if the units are not on them. And if you are moving a unit off or replacing a skylight, you've got to have the fall protection in place. Losing awareness of the edge. This happens a lot easier than you think it would, especially if you're using a monitoring system or warning lines and you're not using a tied off or a rail system where fall would be prevented. This can happen not having awareness of where the edge is, and somebody steps and all of a sudden they're off the edge and on their way to the ground. Improper training leads to the majority of the accidents that we have in the roofing industry and most industries for that matter. Training is not just a matter of bringing somebody in and showing them a video, having them sign a paper and putting them out on the roof. It's ongoing. It is doing things like we're doing today, training your crews, training your people, ongoing training on a monthly basis, ongoing on the job training, specialty training for safety problems on a particular project that may not occur on other projects. So you have to continually train and be prepared. Improper use of equipment. Safety equipment is misused, especially harnesses. You have to train on this, how they put them on. If you don't have the right height of the back brace and the different lines that go across, and you have too much slack in your ropes and pulleys, whatever it may be that you're using, or you don't have your points of access or points of tie off that you screw down, they're not done right. Misuse of them is going to cause somebody an accident or possible death. A poor line of sight, especially happens when you're lifting up onto a roof crane. Your people on the ground that may be lifting on a crane, that's why you have to be trained in use of that. They don't even have a good line of sight. Somebody may not have a line of sight where they're lowering somebody's material down or getting something where someone is. You can't see what's beyond a roof unit or so on. So make sure you've always got a clear line of sight within the work area that you're working in. Prevent injuries. Pitch of the roof. Steeper the roof, the more chance of fall, more chance of injuries, slippage, and so on. So be aware of the pitch. Split level roofing. I've seen this happen where it may only be a foot between one level of the roof or the other. And again, edge awareness not being there, somebody steps right off, falls down, twists an ankle, breaks a leg, so on and so forth, or even more serious injury. Again, be careful on that. And if you have over a certain height, you just can't have a step on a pail anymore and step up. Make sure you have the right either stairs, or using the a folding ladder correctly, whatever it may be that you need to get to that next level. Make sure it's done correctly. Hazardous materials and injuries to avoid, right? It's common to think of only chemical hazards and think of them as liquids. However, hazardous chemicals take various forms. Dust, debris, inhalation can be harmful and fatal in long term. In addition to environmental hazards, many of the tools used in roofing, such as sealants and adhesives, may also contain hazardous chemicals. So we're going to talk about a few of the major factors, but keep that in mind. That's where the SDS sheets come in so importantly to read through them. They will tell you if you have to take any special precautions when using them for eye protection, respiratory protection and different things, ear, whatever it may be. They'll tell you what you need to use. Asbestos. Even though it's been a long time since any new asbestos was installed, older buildings may still contain traces of asbestos in rooftop insulation. It's present nearly in every building constructed before the 1980s. Asbestos causes lung damage and lung cancer. That's been a proven fact. There's been lawsuits on it. Also keep in mind that roof cements and coatings have had asbestos, and some of them still do in today's world. in their products. So you've got to be aware of asbestos that's out there and take particular precautions. Lead. Just as asbestos, many buildings built before 1980 were given several coats of lead paint. This paint can flake off when disturbed, forming an inhalation hazard. Damage to the organs and nervous system can result. Again, you think, well, I'm on a roof, that's not going to happen. But what about a fascia being painted, or if there's wood siding or other areas, or the walls been painted? Does it have lead in it? Because these are OSHA violations if you're not taking the proper precautions and aware of the surroundings that you're working in. Silica. This changes. Industrial and commercial roofs are often lined with gravel. Any gravel mixture can contain sand and silica, which when inhaled causes a condition known as silicosis. This takes the form of persistent cough and shortness of breath. Over long-term silica exposure can cause cancer and organ damage. Again, that's how it's become listed on the OSHA list of precautions. Now, while there are different rules and regulations, and roofing has probably the greatest exemption from this. If you're cutting tile, you're definitely going to fall into where you need to have the wet saw and the proper protection and respiratory. Cutting a reglet in, again, you're going to fall into that. Brooming dust after cutting, it's brooming a concrete deck, brooming dust debris, that's going to be a no, and it's going to get you into this. So again, make sure you are aware of your surroundings, you're following the precautions, and you're following the OSHA regulations on silica. Physical hazards. Definition: anything in the environment that can cause bodily harm can fall under this category of physical safety hazards. Environmental dangers include radiation, including ionizing, non-ionizing, EMFs, microwave, radio waves, etc. So again, there's regulations when you're working up there for cell towers, microwave towers, different things. They're environmental hazards that's listed under OSHA, and there's precautions that you need to take to protect the workforce. So if you have these, you need there. High exposure to sunlight and ultraviolet rays. Roofing's an outside sport, outside activity, right? It is what we do. So you're going to have to make sure that you have the precautions in place, proper coverage, right, and wear the right clothes, eye protection, and sunscreen is necessary. Temperature extremes, hot and cold. OSHA now new regulations, especially on the heat awareness, that's becoming harder and harder in the roofing industry to abide by these, but also can affect your warehouse and working inside in your shop and that too, by what the temperatures are. So again, you have to be aware of these and pay attention and make sure you're doing the proper following OSHA guidelines. Constant loud noise. We have loud noise in our industry. You're running machinery. Again, that's what ear protection's for. Make sure you supply this to your crews and they're wearing it as necessary when they need to do. Methods for eliminating physical hazards. Elimination and substitution, engineering controls, administrative and work practice controls, and PPE. So again, the best way to avoid it is to either substitute a way of doing something or eliminate the hazard altogether. Example of that, how do you, eye injury. So the best way of eliminating an eye injury is to make sure you have the proper eye protection on. Engineering controls, that's basically your safety plan. How are you going to design working on this particular job with these hazards in place and work around them to prevent injury? Administrative and work practices control, that's your safety practices and your safety plan. And then PPE, you have to make sure you have the PPE, which can include hard hats, the right glove for the right job. I mean, cutting metal takes a different type of glove than cleaning with a cleaner or hazardous, or using an all-purpose glove. So you may need 3 gloves for a particular work person on a project. Same way with ear protection, same way with eye protection. Clear may be required, and you may need to have the sun glass type, depending on the time of day and where you're working. So again, keep all these in mind. Not one item fits all circumstances. So questions to ask about physical hazards when assessing your workplace. So you want to ask these questions and you'll get your answers. What kinds of environmental exposures do my employees face? So this should be a question you ask before you go on to any one of your projects. Do my employees work around potentially reactive or explosive chemicals or objects? They probably are most of your job, but what are they? Identify them. What are the long-term effects of working in this environment? Again, enclosed areas, ventilation, or everything may add up to what is particularly the long-term effects. Look at your SDS sheets. Know these answers to the questions so you can have the proper PPE in place. How long are my employees being exposed to sunlight or other environmental factors? Again, in roofing, you're exposed the entire time. So you need to make sure that you've got the proper protection in place and your employees are trained on this. Do my employees have equipment that protects their hearing if necessary? Again, that comes into the noise factor, what equipment you're running, grinding, cutting, pounding, screw guns, whatever it may be. You have to have the noise protection there as necessary. And it'll tell you on these SDS sheets, even for equipment, or recommendations from the safety from the manufacturer, if your protection is recommended or required. What protections are in place for potential extremes in temperature? So again, you got to know what you're doing, what the temperature. If it's hot, you got to make sure you have the proper fluids. You got to make sure you may need a shade break, whatever it may be to prevent an overheated worker, or the same way in cold conditions, preventing frostbite. So again, know your conditions, know what you're working in on that particular job at the time of year it is. Could the equipment that my employees work with pose a risk to their long-term health? Again, you'll know that by working with your manufacturer of these equipment of what the precautions are that they should be taking. They'll tell you on their safety and advisory instructions and their safety videos that go along with this equipment what you should do. Methods to eliminate health hazards. Health hazards means there's a statistically significant evidence based on at least one study conducted in accordance with established scientific principles that acute or chronic health effects may occur in exposed employees. This is what OSHA does, or other industries in the safety. They do a study and they come up with evidence that there is harm that could be relevant from doing the type of work you're going to be doing. The term health hazard includes chemicals which are carcinogens, toxic or highly toxic agents, reproductive toxins, inherent irritants, corrosives, sensitizers, hepatotoxins, nephrotoxins, neurotoxins, agents which act as hematobic systems, and agents which damage the lungs, skins, eyes, and mucous and membranes. A lot of big words in there, but basically what it comes down to, if it can affect your blood system, your respiratory, your breathing, your skin, and the membranes, then it becomes considered a health hazard. Coordinating with job site management. You must have a written and readily accessible safety and health program that identifies, evaluates, and controls safety and health hazards to provide for emergency responses. If you don't have this, and an OSHA inspection comes out, or somebody that's a safety director for another company's visiting the site or on the site, you're going to get penalized. Besides, you're putting your workers at hazard. So this, with not having these things in place, definitely will lead to opening your company and your employees to a lot of liability and danger. Preliminary site evaluation conducted by a qualified person to identify potential site hazards and to aid in the selection of appropriate employee protection methods. Now, when they say a qualified person, that means somebody that you've trained that meets the qualifications of OSHA to be considered a qualified person. And that usually is someone that's gone through safety training. But again, you can look in the OSHA regulations for exactly what's required. But you want to have somebody that is a qualified person to make these. You may not have a safety director or a safety manager in your company, depending on your size, but somebody has to be designated, whether that's your foreman, your superintendent, whoever it may be in the company. Site control program to protect employees against hazardous contamination. At a minimum, it must have a site map, site work zones, site communication, safe work practices, the use of a buddy system, and identification of nearest medical aid. So you have to have a site safety plan in place. And you can use your Google map as your site map if you don't have anything else. And you can highlight and write on there what your work zones are, where the hazardous conditions are, what you're going to be doing. And you also have to be able to have a list of the numbers that to get these medical, besides 911, what are the closest medical site? These will be asked of your crews if OSHA does show up on site. And use of a buddy system. What your buddy system comes into play is that if there is an evacuation off the roof, someone is always responsible for another person, so there's nobody left behind. That's just that. I mean, that should be a given. but you want to have something in place, foreman responsible for his crew, this crew member's responsible for that, whatever it may be, as long as you have a policy laying that out. The employer must conduct medical surveillance of workers who have been exposed above permissible exposure limits of hazardous substances. It should be conducted at least annually when a worker moves into a new work site and when a worker experiences exposure from unexpected emergency releases at the end of employment. Silica does fall into this. There is a medical section in there. Again, I'm not getting into the deep dive of OSHA on this, but you want to be aware of what hazards you're working in that may require medical follow-up. And sometimes that will also say on the SDS sheets as well. The job site must provide an informational program describing any exposure during operations and the inspection of drums and containers prior to removal and opening. That is going to be, your liquids and your coatings and your adhesives. You got to have a program in place. So again, that means you got to have an OSHA-proof can. You just can't open a can and start pouring it out and having it poured into a coffee can, whatever it may be. So you have to have your program in place of how this is done, how you're doing it. So your safety program could encompass this in one shot. So you're not doing this per every job. This is what your company policy is. And the SDS sheet should also be able to help you along with this. Decontamination procedures and emergency response plans must be in place before employees begin working in hazardous waste operations. This would come in under your asbestos removal for sure. So again, if you're licensed in your state for asbestos removal, you know how to do that. If you're hiring an outside contractor that is your asbestos removal, then that'll be in place. If you're doing asbestos and you're not trained and you don't have the proper procedures in, you will get an OSHA violation. Employees must also create safer environments by developing and implementing effective safety plans. What that means is a safety plan has to actually work. It just can't be an off-the-shelf from another industry, let's say, that you're using. It needs to take in consideration what we do in the roofing industry and deal with it being roofing specific as well. Items to consider: training. So there's three main components to hazardous material training: documentation, basic overview training, and labeling. So again, when you're training people and you working with hazardous, and again, I'm telling you, a lot of the chemicals we're working with are in this category. That will come into training per what the SDS may say could be a great way of doing it. So you want to document this training happened. You want to have basic overview training, which basically means you're actually showing your employees through a training process how to do this, and you have proper labeling. It goes back to we're talking about materials, moving your chemicals from can into a proper container. So once again, you want to make sure that everything is labeled so we know what's in these containers after you may have taken them out of their original packaging. And disposal, how and where to properly dispose. Asbestos is a great example. They have to go to a specific site. You have to have a paper trail where it goes. But we're also running into seeing that more and more, depending. This can even be a state issue more than it is a federal issue of your hazardous waste from your cans, your glue buckets, your coating buckets, and cleaners and so forth. Where are you disposing? They may not be legally allowed to be disposed of in a general dump site. They may have to go to a special place. So you will be responsible for the paperwork tracking this of how you disposed of this material. This is going to get more and more complicated and stringent in regulations in the future, not less. So these are things you get into place now, you're covered. You don't have to worry about violations. And you're also encompassing the safety of your crews. So the facts: 30% of roofing workers who handled asbestos also faced air concentrations above the permissible levels. So that is a fact. That happens. 85% of job site injuries are preventable. These are based upon statistics that are calculated in the safety world. And an estimated 2.2 million construction industry workers are exposed to silica dust annually. Again, as I said, it depends on what you're doing in our industry, whether you're within the exposure limits. This is I don't want to use, I hate to use the gray area, but read, understand, have a silica plan in place. That's got to be part of your safety plan, that you, even if you're not on any job that has a silica issue, you still want the plan in place and part of your general safety and your employees trained on it. So what's the conclusion from this, right? keeping your job site safe and secure is vital to your business and your day every day, right? You want everyone to come into work, go home safe, see their family, come back tomorrow, know they work for a Class A company where safety is number one. I will tell you, if you do everything right on the safety front and get rid of these hazards and do everything you can to prevent it and make it as safe as possible on your day-to-day operations, your production and your output and everything, your quality all falls into place naturally. It does work. So that's all we have for today, and I look forward to catching you on next month.